Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Christy Matheson, and I'll be your moderator for today's press briefing. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce the Premier of Nova Scotia, the Honourable Iain Rankin. He'll have a few comments to make, and then we'll go to the room for questions.
Thank you, Christy, and thanks for coming today and those joining us on the phone. Just before I take a few questions, I wanted to say that we had a great first cabinet meeting today, lively discussion. And as I said last week, we're looking forward to getting to work and introducing a throne speech in the House, working on a budget, and we're finalizing that now. I just want to, one more note, congratulate the heroes who rescued 31 fishers from the Scallop vessel, the Atlantic Destiny, earlier this week. And this was a joint effort involving the U.S. Coast Guard and the Canadian forces. Their collaborative effort saved lives in extreme conditions, and we thank them for their swift action. All right, I'm ready for your questions.
Thanks for letting us in the room, Premier. Premier, given what we're hearing from Ottawa about them potentially authorizing the moderate livelihood fishery, if that happens, what is the province's position in terms of authorizing buyer's licenses for people to buy from people with a moderate livelihood license?
So our acts are reliant on the federal government. They're the ones that regulate harvesting and the seasons. They have the authority for harvesting and the responsibility. Our focus is to ensure health and safety of consumers, so our regulations are dependent on the federal government's responsibility.
But in other words, if the feds come out and say, yes, we're going to do this, as Minister Jordan indicated yesterday, and a fisherman has a moderate livelihood tag, will this province authorize buyer's licenses to buy from that fisherman?
So again, we have an act, the Fisheries and Coastal Resources Act, and our regulations are specific to how consumers are protected. It is very much between the federal government and the Mi'kmaq to establish what a moderate livelihood is.
No, I understand that, Premier. I'm not asking you to do that. What I'm asking is, if those two parties make that decision, they establish that, it's authorized in the eyes of the feds, is this province then prepared to grant buyer's licenses for people to purchase from people with federally sanctioned moderate livelihood tags?
Yeah, so again, our regulations will be dependent on whatever the federal government decides. As long as they're withholding the responsibility, they have that responsibility for harvesting, and we'll make sure that our regulations abide by their act.
Premier, can you please tell us a little bit more about this first come, first serve setup for the AstraZeneca vaccine? How will this be run, and if it's another online portal, how should Nova Scotians be confident that this will work?
Yeah, so discussions took place right away as I asked Dr. Strang to ensure that we had an organization that was able to deliver the vaccine that wouldn't impede our current major vaccine delivery. I want to thank Doctors Nova Scotia and Pharmacy Nova Scotia, who has stepped up. There'll be 26 locations, so if you do the math, there'll be roughly 500 doses out to those sites that they're willing to do that. We'll have a plan, a more detailed plan next week.
Right, I'm curious about this first come, first serve setup. How should Nova Scotians expect that to work?
And that'll be up to the providers. We've just started that discussion with them. We wanted to make sure that they were able to do that, and they're going to be able to. It's important to note that it is voluntary for that age cohort, and that'll be the first round of vaccines for AstraZeneca. And I'm happy that we have a provider that stepped up already to take that on.
Do you worry, though, that, we saw what happened on Monday with the site for 80+ crashing. Do you worry about, essentially creating a stampede when you say to the public, first come, first serve, only 300 of you are going to get into each of these slots? How are you going to try to mitigate that?
Well, I think that speaks to making sure that we make a thoughtful decision on what we're receiving from the federal government, and making sure that we have a plan. We looked at what other provinces are doing and what age cohorts would be most appropriate for this vaccine. There's always lessons learned. I think Nova Scotia has been a leader in many files related to the COVID-19 situation, and we're going to continue to make sure that we learn lessons and that we appropriately distribute the vaccine to those that need it the most.
You announced yesterday we were accepting AstraZeneca, but it did take about a day to come to that decision. Why didn't you immediately tell the federal government, we'll take this vaccine? What was the delay?
Well, there was no delay. We had until today, so we made the decision a day earlier than we needed to. But it was important for me to learn from Public Health and Dr. Strang and get their comfort level that we wouldn't distract from the very important delivery of our major vaccine plan with starting at those that are over the age of 80.
The opposition has really kind of took issue with that. Tim Houston came out yesterday saying, hey, if the federal government's offering you more vaccine, you don't hesitate, you take it. What's your reaction to that? Do you think maybe you could have moved a bit swifter?
Well, I don't think it's appropriate to politicize COVID-19. Nova Scotia has done very well working with public health, ensuring that we're thoughtful about our decisions. I did speak with Dr. Strang, and within hours he was directed to create a plan that would make sure that we're most appropriately focused on those that need vaccines, and overall the strategy is to get vaccines out as quickly as possible to all Nova Scotians.
What can you tell us about the conversations that you had last week with Mr. Houston and Mr. Burrell in terms of whether you may be on the same page about anything going into next week?
I think there's areas of mutual understanding that we need to advance. Mr. Burrell was the meeting I had in person my first day in office, and we discussed issues related to the environment and helping those that need it the most as we prepare for a budget. I did have a virtual meeting with Mr. Houston, and he assured me that he would find ways to work together on issues, and I'll take him at his word, and hopefully we'll be in the House on time with the deal that I'm hearing that we have with our House leaders.
You expect things are a go for Tuesday?
That's my expectation. What I'm hearing from my House leader is we have a deal to look at a hybrid system, so limited members in the House and the rest would be virtual.
I appreciate the point you made about looking for common ground, but your predecessor talked a very good game about that when he was first elected in 2013, and there was very little common ground. Where is your mindset, or what is your philosophy, now that you're Premier, when it comes to considering opposition legislation?
I think nobody owns all good ideas, so I'm definitely open to bills or ideas being brought forward by anyone, and that's why it was important for me to meet with the leaders. I have respect for them, and there's a number of issues that they brought forward that I think that are important, and where we can agree, and hopefully they'll support the budget, but we'll see.
Premier, I'm just seeing that we're lifting restrictions starting tomorrow. Can you talk a bit about that? Why was that decision made?
Again, we're always ensuring that we're looking out for public safety, number one. There was a number of days in a row that we had a low case count. Credit to Nova Scotians for coming out in record numbers for testing. So we now have a number of days in a row with low case counts. We're not as concerned about having cases with no known cause, and so Dr. Strang was comfortable. Public Health brought forward a recommendation that we would relax those, and I'm happy that we're able to do that, so we have more businesses that are able to open later, and we're going back to where we were previous to the restrictions coming on.
Just a clarification on the point of first come, first serve. Are you indicating that it will be up to the doctors and pharmacists to actually go through opening bookings and having that first come, first serve process go through them?
It'll go through them, and again, these are two providers, doctors and pharmacists, that will have those bookings being made first come, first serve on a voluntary basis, and we'll have more details once that's finalized.
Premier, it was suggested last week by Sierra Club that the province could ease its reliance on coal by entering into readily available deals with Quebec to buy hydro from there. Is that a consideration?
All considerations. I think it's really important that we look at reducing our reliance on coal. I was definitive about that I believe we can do that by 2030, and we can do that to protect ratepayers, because the cost of coal is not as predictable as wind. Wind is now the cheapest form of energy in the province, so there is local homegrown renewable resources that we'll be able to tap into, but I do have interest in the Atlantic Loop project. If the federal government is prepared to put resources into that project, I'll be supportive of that.
We'll go to the phones, starting with Canadian Press, Keith Doucette.
Good afternoon, Premier. I just want to revisit Ottawa's decision on the Indigenous fishery yesterday. I'm just wondering what you think of Ottawa's plan, and is there anything the province can do to smooth the waters, because it looks like at least one band and the Assembly of Mi'kmaq Chiefs have rejected the overture. So I wonder if there's anything you do to smooth the waters, realizing there are at least 2 lawsuits in relation to the regulations around selling catches.
Yeah, I'm not going to speak to any matters before the court, but I do think dialogue is very important, and the Government of Canada has said that they're prepared to have those discussions on how to advance the fishery with the Mi'kmaq, so I'm encouraged by that. We need to continue to have that dialogue. It's a nation-to-nation relationship the federal government has, and I'm encouraged by that.
Move on to All Nova Scotia's Brian Flynn.
Hi, Premier. The release the government issued yesterday said you directed Dr. Strang on Tuesday to come up with a plan to distribute the AstraZeneca vaccine. Wondering why was it necessary to issue a directive, and what time of day did that happen?
So that was in the late afternoon after the press conference. I was briefed before the press conference to talk about options on the AstraZeneca, and at that point I didn't have full comfort that we would be able to utilize the vaccine alongside our current major vaccine delivery program. But I did ask Dr. Strang to ensure that we were looking at options and reaching out to all providers that we could to see how they could best utilize that and where we could deliver it.
Henderson with the Halifax Examiner.
Hi, good afternoon, Premier Rankin. What changes are being made to assure Nova Scotians over the age of 80 that they won't face the same frustrations and disappointment when they try to book an appointment next Monday? I was helping a friend, try to do that, and as you know, it was a disappointing experience. So what will make it different next Monday than what we went through last Monday?
So I think there's always lessons learned, and sending out 48,000 letters for a very low amount of appointments was something that I think presented a challenge. So moving forward, we're going to be looking at the month of when people are born to limit the list of invites. And on Monday, there's a larger volume of appointments that could be made. So again, moving forward, lessons are learned, and hopefully we're going to be able to streamline the process more and more as we keep moving forward.
Next, we'll go to Global's Jesse Thomas.
Oh, can I have a follow-up?
We'll loop back to you in a moment, Jennifer. Next, we'll go to Global's Jesse Thomas.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Premier. I'm just wondering, with Canada's National Advisory Committee on Immunization, you talked about getting the vax out to as many Nova Scotians as possible. Well, that NACI group, they're advising, or I guess they kind of stated that the window between the Pfizer, Moderna, and AstraZeneca can now be expanded and still be effective. I'm just wondering, with that revelation, does this change our timeline? In particular, are we going to hold on to this hard and fast rule of holding that second dose, or are we going to start spreading it out a little more, knowing that we can spread the window between doses?
So I've had preliminary discussions with Dr. Strang. He wanted to make sure we had that official advice. I know BC jumped out in front of that advice, but logic would follow that we would be able to hold back. We wouldn't have to hold back the second dose. So we should be able to get every Nova Scotian their first dose by the end of June.
We'll loop back to Keith Doucette with Canadian Press.
I'm good, thanks.
Next, we'll go to Brian Flynn with All Nova Scotia.
Sorry. Premier, I just was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about how the House sitting is going to work next week. We're not actually familiar with the details of the agreement that you say has been worked out, and I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit about it. And I'm wondering if you could sort of assure Nova Scotians that there will be the normal sort of transparency and the normal sort of access through things like Law Amendments Committee.
I'm not familiar with the details on how the committee structure will work. I know that all three House leaders have come to an agreement on having, as I said, limited members in the House so that we can continue to operate the House in a way that works well, moving bills forward, and most members will be on virtual. For the details of how that works and how the operations of the legislature itself works, those questions are best posed to the Speaker.
Next, we'll go to Jennifer Henderson with the Halifax Examiner.
I wanted to follow up on the coal. You mentioned, wanting to move off coal by 2030. Just wanted you to comment, Premier Rankin, on a UARB decision, which said that burning more biomass at Brooklyn could cost ratepayers between $7 and $10 million a year. So will you consider reversing the directive to Nova Scotia Power from the Order in Council last May to burn biomass to replace delayed energy from Muskrat Falls?
Moving forward, as I said, wind is the cheapest form of renewable energy right now on the market. We do have advancement of some small wood heat projects. The first phase is complete. We're looking at a second phase. Those are more efficient than the location you're referencing. But biomass internationally is recognized as a renewable energy. My intention is to continue to focus on protecting ratepayers and ensuring that we're reducing our reliance on fossil fuels, and that's going to be the continued focus moving forward.
We'll loop back to Global's Jesse Thomas. Jesse, do you have any more questions for the Premier?
Thank you. Yeah. No, sorry, there's a bit of background noise there. I just wanted to follow up, Premier. You mentioned with this light that we have a longer window between these three major vaccine producers. You said all Nova Scotians can expect to have a shot by the end of June. Does that mean we're going to change up our plan and maybe abandon that reserving of the second dose? Can you just elaborate on that?
So, as you know now that we don't have to hold back the second dose, that's the preliminary discussions I've had with Dr. Strang. With Moderna and Pfizer, we'll be looking at the move. As we move forward, we will not have to hold that back. So if you do the math, that means that the doses that we have been promised, our allocation means that all Nova Scotians would be able to get their first dose by the end of June.
We'll go back to the room. Anybody with more questions for the Premier?
Premier, I'm just wondering, you touched on this briefly last week, but the idea of paid sick time, Dr. Strang, stressed the need for people not to go to work when they're sick. As you well know, there are many people who don't have that luxury because they're choosing between a paycheck and staying home. What is this, I know there have been federal programs, but what is this government looking at in terms of potential options for people, minimum wage workers, grocery clerks, those types of folks who simply have no access to paid sick time?
Yeah, and again, I think that it's important that some of these issues are an employer-to-employee relationship issue. I've heard the concerns that some don't feel comfortable to show up to work, that they can't miss a day of pay. So I would encourage at this point employers to have that understanding, and people that are sick should stay home.
Is it a policy, though, that your government is interested in exploring?
I would be interested in all public policy that helps the lives of Nova Scotians. I'm interested in how we could move forward and looking at how other provinces treat this issue. So far, I've found only two that have regulated sick days. So it's a matter of if it's a government responsibility or if employers can provide that benefit to their employees.
Sorry, just going back to everyone getting a second dose or first dose by the end of June. How does that work with the current strategy we have? I think we're still in phase one. So does that mean the whole three-phase system has to be revamped, or how do you see that working?
I just see it advancing more quickly. Dr. Strang can give details. We have a briefing tomorrow. So the preliminary numbers show us that we would, instead of holding that second dose, we'd be able to get the first dose out quicker.
Back to the phones for one more question for Jennifer Henderson with the Halifax Examiner. Jennifer, do you have any more questions for the Premier?
Yes, I'm sorry. trying to do something there. So I just want to get back to Monday when people over 80 are trying to book. I understand that there'll be more appointments available. This wasn't clear, Premier Rankin, on whether it will be done by birth month on Monday or whether it'll be the same system as we had last Monday.
So we can give you details tomorrow. We just want to make sure that right at this point that everyone can call in. There's a lot more appointments to book. So there is, I believe, 13,000 appointments available, so a much higher number. So we look forward to having a much better process for those over the age of 80.
And that's all the time we have for questions for the Premier. Thank you, Premier.